In today's video, I'll be comparing latency in CockroachDB and AWS DynamoDB. Both databases work quite differently, but I'm hoping that in this example, I can show you how a globally distributed CockroachDB database stacks up against a globally distributed or global tables instance of DynamoDB. What I'll be demonstrating in today's demo is a US-based user and an EU-based user, both talking to their local for reads and writes, and then also the latency involved in replicating from one region into another in DynamoDB, and what kind of latencies you can expect to get as one user operating against a global database that's receiving writes from another region. I've recorded a number of other comparison videos, so we've got GCP AlloyDB, AWS Aurora, Azure Cosmos DB, Cockroach of course, and GCP Cloud Spanner. They're all available on YouTube, so have a watch and please feel free to give your feedback. In this example, because I'm writing to DynamoDB, I've had to modify the code slightly. So I've added a new DynamoDB repo that will interact with a DynamoDB item, which is just a UUID. Into the write function, I take the region, which I'll just ignore because that's not pertinent to this example. I record the start time, I generate a new ID, I then marshal the object that I'll be writing to DynamoDB, and I put it into my new table called CRDB latency comparison. Put the object and return any errors that I receive. I then return the elapsed time and 0 errors. Like with most of the other cloud service provider Postgres compatible databases, replicas are done asynchronously. DynamoDB in that respect for global tables is eventually consistent. So I will enter a loop and sleep for 50 milliseconds just to make sure that the replica has replicated from one region into another. So I'll try to get the item from the table using the ID as a filter. If I receive an error, I'll bail early. If I don't receive an item, that means it hasn't replicated fully yet, so I'll sleep for a very short amount of time and then try again. Ultimately, I'll keep on doing this until I've got an object. Just to walk you through how I created the infrastructure, I have a DynamoDB table that I'll base in the US in US East 1 called CRDB latency comparison, whose hash key will just be an ID. I'll pay per request because I'll be just spinning this up and then tearing it down after. I've got the same table in the EU, and I merged the two together with the use of a global table, which has replicas across US East 1 and EU West 2. I then create a user whose only job is to put items into and read items out of DynamoDB, and then I assign the policy to them. So let's get cracking. Any credentials you see here will be long gone by the time the video is available. I'll launch the app. I'll first deploy against London. I don't need to tweak any of those settings. I'll add my secrets. I'll be writing in this instance to Europe and reading from Europe just to simulate the experience of a user in Europe interacting with a global table. The region doesn't have to be anything. The database will be DynamoDB, so that's how I'll switch to use my implementation of the DynamoDB repo. And here are my secrets. So I'll paste those in and I'll deploy. With that deploying, I'll now be able to go into apps, and my app is here. I'll look at the monitoring. So what we're seeing here is a London-based user talking to a London-based database for both reads and writes. And what we're seeing is low read latencies of around 4.5 seconds and low write latencies of around 6.5 seconds. So all positive there. This time I will tweak the configuration so that I write to Europe still, but I'll be reading from the States. This will simulate any latencies that are involved in the replication of the data from one region into another, how quickly the data is available to someone in the States. With those secrets applied, the application will restart. I'll just focus on one of the instances, and we'll start to see the latencies change once that deployment has finished. The application has been restarted because of the new secrets, and now we'll start to get different latencies. I'll give that a couple of seconds to settle down. Okay, so the write latency is starting to come down. And just to confirm, I am still writing to the London-based database, but my latency now is around 79 milliseconds, and my read latency has gone up to around 1.5 seconds. So that's the time it takes DynamoDB to replicate my data from London to the States and then be read from my London-based user. I'll tear that down. And now I'll do the same, but for the US user. Let's redeploy. I'll tweak the configuration this time. This time I will simulate the user in the US. Confirm settings, head back to the terminal. That's a nice new feature, I like that. I'll change my settings. Note that this time I'm writing to and reading from Virginia. That will deploy, and once it's ready, I'll hop back into the monitoring terminal. Now that the machines are coming up, I'll be able to start seeing my instances. I'm just going to refresh so I get the instance list, and I'm only going to focus on one of them. So this is simulating a user in the States writing to and reading from the States. I'll give it a couple of seconds to settle in again. And we're seeing great latencies again. We're seeing around 2.5 seconds for read latencies and around 5.5 seconds for write latencies. Nothing spooky, all expected. Now I'll update the secrets again. This time the US user will be writing to the US, but reading from the EU. And this will simulate any latencies that EU users are likely to see from the US users' data in replication to the EU. I'll give that another couple of seconds to settle down. Okay, and what we're seeing is around 108 milliseconds of write latency this time, and around 1.9 seconds for read latency. That's the time it takes for the US user to write data to the US and for it to be asynchronously replicated by DynamoDB into the EU. I'll tear that down one more time. To summarize, it was easy to set up the DynamoDB global table. Once I'd figured out how to do it in Terraform, I think I'm still using the V1. I wasn't able to get the V2 version of the AWS SDK in Terraform to work. But what I found interesting in this test is the latencies were low for reads and writes when you're operating against the same region. But as soon as you start to read and write to different regions, the latencies start to go up. Any user in a different region to the region that's being written to can expect around 1.9 seconds of latency between the EU and the US. Contrast this to CockroachDB that can pin data to regions. There's no cross-region replication unless you want it. For example, the global table topology would do this, but it's still synchronous. You're always guaranteed to get a globally consistent view of your data. DynamoDB replicates asynchronously to the other regions, so while data can be available in the other regions, it does take a little bit of time to get there. Something to be aware of. I caveat this all with I'm not an expert in DynamoDB. This is my first outing with DynamoDB in terms of creating the tables and interacting with it from Go code. So any feedback you can provide would be greatly appreciated.